The first time I saw Mike was at a college seminar. We were both there for extra credit. Though we walked very different paths, he was a business major, while I was immersed in literature. I noticed him the moment he raised his hand, challenging the professor with a sharp, insightful question. After class, fate placed us at the same coffee shop, and from that moment, it felt like the universe had conspired to bring us together. We talked for hours, covering everything from college ambitions to childhood memories. I grew up in a pretty strict household, he admitted, taking a slow sip of his coffee. My parents are deeply religious. I shrugged, smiling. Mine are the opposite free thinkers. They always taught me to question everything. Mike chuckled. Guess we're from completely different planets. Despite our differences, an undeniable chemistry sparked between us. Before long, we were inseparable, studying late into the night and exploring the city on weekends, each new experience pulling us closer together. 2 years in, we decided to move in together. It was the logical choice. Our separate apartments were far from campus, and by then, we couldn't imagine being apart. But when Mike told his parents, their reaction was far from supportive. At a family dinner, Mrs. Davis was the first to speak. Living together before marriage, Mike? You know how we feel about that? Mike shifted in his seat. Mom, times have changed. It's really not a big deal. Not a big deal? Mr. Davis echoed, his voice sharp. In this house it is. You're living in sin. The weight of their judgment hung in the air. Trying to ease the tension, I spoke up. We respect your beliefs, but this is our decision. We're adults. Mrs. Davis sighed, shaking her head. It's just not the way we raised you. Mike reached for my hand. Lizzie and I love each other. We're building a life together, and I hope you can support that. The night ended on an uneasy note, but we stood by our choice. We found a cozy apartment near campus, turning it into our own little world. Days turned into weeks, then months. Our bond only grew stronger, but the tension with his family never fully faded. It lingered, like a distant radio playing an unresolved melody. Then, one evening, there was a knock at the door. Mrs. Davis stood there holding a pie. I thought I'd stop by, see how you two are doing, she said, her eyes scanning the apartment. We're doing great, Mrs. Davis, I answered, forcing warmth into my voice. She set the pie on the table, then hesitated. This is just temporary, right? You'll be married soon? Mike cleared his throat. We haven't decided that yet, Mom. As time passed, their expectations loomed over us. What had once been carefree movie nights and spontaneous adventures now carried a shadow, the unspoken question of marriage. One evening, as we cooked dinner in our tiny kitchen, Mike turned to me, his voice careful. Lizzie, have you ever thought about, a wedding? I paused mid-chop, glancing up. For us? Are you proposing? He gave a nervous laugh, rubbing the back of his neck. Not exactly. I mean, yes, I want to marry you someday, but right now it's more about my parents. Maybe if we had a ceremony, they'd back off. I sighed. So, you're saying a wedding without the legal paperwork? He nodded. Just a thought. We can invite friends, make it a fun day. My parents get their wedding, and we get some peace. It wasn't the romantic proposal I'd imagined, but I understood his reasoning. All right, I said slowly, but on one condition. We do it our way. No big church wedding, just something small and intimate. Mike grinned, relief evident on his face. Deal. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of preparations. We chose a beautiful outdoor venue, invited our close friends and family, and planned a simple but heartfelt ceremony. When we broke the news to his parents, their reaction was surprisingly subdued. An outdoor wedding? Mrs. Davis asked, raising an eyebrow. Well, it's unconventional, but if it means you two are taking the next step, I suppose we can support it, Mr. Davis added. As long as you're committed to each other, that's what matters. The day of the wedding was sunny and bright. I wore a simple white dress, and Mike looked dashing in his suit. Our friends cheered, and even Mike's parents seemed genuinely happy. During the reception, Mrs. Davis pulled me aside. "Lizzie, I want to apologize," she began, her voice soft. "I know we've been hard on you two, but seeing you together today, I realize that love is what truly matters." I smiled, touched by her words. "Thank you, Mrs. Davis. That means a lot." The day ended on a high note, with everyone dancing and celebrating our love. It felt like we had finally won Mike's parents over, and I hoped this would be a fresh start for us. But as days passed, their daily visits began. They'd drop by unannounced, often with unsolicited advice or thinly veiled criticisms. It was as if the wedding had given them a free pass to interfere in our lives. One evening, as Mike and I were unwinding after a long day, there was a knock at the door. Opening it, I found Mrs. Davis holding a casserole dish. "Just thought I'd drop off some dinner," she said with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Thanks," I replied, taking the dish. "But you know, you don't have to do this." She waved a hand dismissively. "It's no trouble. I just thought since you're always so busy, you might not have time to cook." I forced a smile, sensing the underlying judgment. "We managed, but thanks anyway." As the door closed, I sighed deeply. Mike wrapped an arm around me. "It'll be okay," he whispered. It started with the subtle comments, the not-so-innocent questions. "Why is the house so messy?" Or, "Have you considered cooking something more nutritious?" Mrs. Davis would ask, her tone dripping with faux concern. One evening, after a long, exhausting day at work, I walked into our apartment only to find Mrs. Davis in the living room, rearranging our bookshelves. "Mrs. Davis, what are you doing?" I asked, startled. She glanced up, completely unfazed. "Just tidying up a little. These shelves looked so cluttered." Before I could respond, Mike emerged from the kitchen, carrying 2 cups of tea. "Mom's just trying to help, Lizzie," he said lightly, playing the peacemaker. I exhaled slowly, my patience wearing thin. "This is our home, Mike. We didn't ask for help." Mrs. Davis pursed her lips, her eyes glistening as if I'd wounded her. "I'm just trying to be useful. After all, we're family now." Moments like these became more and more frequent. They dropped by unannounced, offered advice we hadn't asked for, and scrutinized decisions Mike and I had made together. The boundaries between our lives and theirs had blurred into nothing. One evening, after yet another stressful visit, Mike and I finally sat down for a serious conversation. "Mike, this has to stop," I said, my voice taut with frustration. "I can't keep living like this, feeling like a guest in my own home." He ran a hand through his hair, looking drained. "I know, Lizzie. It's just, they're my parents. How do I ask them to step back without hurting them?" I met his eyes, my voice softer now. "But what about us? Our peace of mind? We can't keep sacrificing that just to avoid upsetting them." A week later, we invited them over for dinner, determined to set things straight. The evening started pleasantly small talk about work, mutual friends, the latest news. But as the main course was served, I took a steadying breath and spoke. "Mrs. Davis, Mr. Davis, there's something we need to talk about," I said carefully. Mr. Davis paused mid-bite, looking up. "What is it?" I exchanged a glance with Mike, who gave a reassuring nod. "It's about the frequent visits and the constant involvement in our lives," I continued, choosing my words cautiously. Mrs. Davis blinked, visibly caught off guard. "We're only trying to help." Mike stepped in. "Mom, Dad, we know you care, and we love you for it, but it's becoming overwhelming. We need space to figure things out as a couple, to make our own choices, even our own mistakes." Tears welled in Mrs. Davis's eyes. "After everything we've done for you, this is how you treat us?" Mr. Davis's expression hardened. "We're just looking out for you, son. It seems Lizzie doesn't appreciate family." A pang of guilt twisted in my chest, but I stood my ground. "This isn't about appreciation. It's about respect. Respect for our boundaries, our independence." The room fell silent, thick with tension. Mrs. Davis dabbed at her eyes, her shoulders trembling. "We just wanted to be part of your lives. I never thought it would come to this." Mike looked torn, loyalty pulling him in both directions, but he stayed firm. "Mom, we love you, but this is our life. We need you to understand that." The evening ended in quiet devastation, Mrs. Davis wiping away tears, Mr. Davis tight-lipped with disappointment. And yet, beneath the discomfort, there was an unspoken understanding that things had to change. As they left, a mix of relief and unease settled over me. The house felt strangely still in the days that followed. No unexpected visits, no unsolicited advice, just silence. At times it felt liberating. Other times it felt hollow. Every knock on the door sent a jolt through me, half expecting them to appear. But they never did. One evening, as Mike and I curled up on the couch, he finally voiced the thought that had been weighing on him. "Lizzie, do you think we were too harsh?" His voice was uncertain. "I mean, they're my parents. Maybe we overreacted." I took his hand, squeezing it gently. "Mike, it's not about being harsh. It's about setting boundaries. We did what we had to do." He exhaled heavily. "I know, it's just hard. I never imagined it would come to this with them." As days turned into weeks, we began to feel the weight of our decision. There were no more surprise visits, but there were also no calls or messages. It was as if we had cut ties completely. During this period, I often found solace in browsing property listings online. One day, as I was scrolling through a beautiful house in a neighboring town, it caught my eye. It had a large garden, a spacious living area, and most importantly, it was far away from our current life. "Mike, come look at this," I called out. He joined me, peering at the screen. "Wow, it's beautiful. But why are you looking at houses?" I hesitated, choosing my words carefully. I was thinking maybe it's time for a fresh start, somewhere new where we can create our own memories away from all this drama. He looked surprised. "You mean move? Leave everything behind?" I nodded. "It's drastic, I know, but maybe it's what we need." We discussed it at length, weighing the pros and cons. The idea of starting anew was enticing but also terrifying. Yet, the more we talked, the more it felt right. A few weeks later, we visited the house. It was even more beautiful in person, and the neighborhood seemed perfect. After much consideration, I decided to use the money I had inherited from my grandmother to buy it. The day we signed the papers, I felt a mix of emotions: excitement for the new beginning, but also sadness for what we were leaving behind. The move went smoothly, and soon we were settling into our new home. It felt like a dream. The peace and quiet were just what we needed. One evening, as we were enjoying a quiet dinner in our new dining room, Mike said, "Lizzie, I think this was the best decision we ever made." I smiled, feeling content. "I think so too." The first few months in our new home were like a dream. The mornings were quiet, filled with the chirping of birds, and the evenings brought a calm, tranquil energy. Mike and I fell into a comfortable routine, enjoying the privacy and peace that our new surroundings provided. The past seemed like a distant memory, and the attention that once surrounded our lives had all but disappeared. Until one fateful day. I was in the kitchen preparing dinner when the doorbell rang. Mike went to answer it. I heard murmurs and then a familiar voice. My heart sank. It was Mrs. Davis. I walked to the entrance, my face revealing my shock. There they were, Mrs. and Mr. Davis, suitcases in tow, standing at our doorstep. "Mom? Dad? What are you doing here?" Mike asked, his voice filled with surprise. Mrs. Davis smiled a bit too sweetly. "We missed you, dear, and we thought, why not pay a visit?" I tried to keep my composure. "It's unexpected." Mr. Davis chimed in. "We just wanted to see where our son is living now." "Is that so wrong?" Mike seemed torn. "Of course not. but a heads up would have been nice. Mrs. Davis looked around, her eyes scanning our home. Oh, what a lovely place you have here, much nicer than the old one. I bristled but said nothing. The visit turned into a stay. One night became 2, then 3. They began to settle in, making themselves comfortable, much like they had in our previous home. One evening after dinner, I pulled Mike aside. Mike, we can't go down this road again. We moved to escape this. He sighed. I know, Lizzie, but they're my parents. I can't just throw them out. Then what? Let them take over our lives again? Mrs. Davis, who seemed to have overheard our conversation, walked over, her eyes welling up with tears. Is that how you feel, Mike? That we're a burden? Mike looked helplessly at me, then back at his mother. Mom, it's not like that. We just wish you had told us you were coming. She sniffled. We just wanted to be close to our son, but it seems we're not welcome here either. I felt a deep sense of unease the moment Mike's parents mentioned they had made a decision about their living situation. Mike and I had been discussing the issue privately, trying to find a delicate way to address it. Now, it seemed the matter was being forced into the open. Lizzie, Mike, Mr. Davis began, his tone weighty. We have some news. Mike shifted in his seat, already sensing what was coming. Go on, he said cautiously. Mrs. Davis, her voice light with forced cheer, announced, We've sold our house. We realized we don't need it anymore, not when we have such a wonderful family home here with you two. I froze. You did what? We wanted to be closer to you both. Mr. Davis explained as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Mrs. Davis's expression turned wounded at my reaction. We are family. Why wouldn't you want us here? I took a deep breath, steadying myself. It was time to say what I had wanted to for so long. This house, it's mine. It's not owned jointly by Mike and me. It's in my name only. I walked to the study, retrieving the ownership documents and setting them on the table. Mrs. Davis hesitated before picking them up, her eyes scanning the papers. Slowly, she looked back at me, her face pale. But, you're married? What's yours is Mike's, and vice versa. A slow, knowing smile crossed my lips. That's where you're mistaken. We had a wedding ceremony, yes, but Mike and I never legally married. We never signed any official documents. So technically, you're not my in-laws. The room fell into a stunned silence. Mrs. Davis's lips parted slightly as if searching for words, while Mr. Davis looked to Mike, expecting some form of denial. Mike took my hand, his touch firm, unwavering. It's true, Mom, Dad. We thought you'd accept us more easily if we had a ceremony, but we never felt the need to make it legal. Mrs. Davis let out a strangled sob. So you deceived us? And now you're throwing us out? Shock quickly turned to anger. A sham wedding? Mrs. Davis's voice quivered with fury. And you think that makes everything right? Mike exhaled heavily. It wasn't about deceiving anyone. We wanted to celebrate our love in a way that felt right for us. Mrs. Davis's face deepened to a furious red. You dare defy the sanctity of marriage, live together in sin, and mock us with a fake wedding. I've had enough. Mr. Davis stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. And you, he spat, eyes locked on me. You're nothing but a witch twisting my son away from his family and his values. I stiffened at the venom in his words but refused to back down. I haven't taken Mike from anyone. He's made his own choices, and it's about time you respected them. Mrs. Davis's tear-filled gaze landed on her son. Mike, come home with us. Leave this woman. She's done nothing but pull you into her web of deceit. Mike remained calm, the eye in the storm. Mom, Dad, I love you both, but my place is here. Lizzie has only ever been patient and understanding, even when you weren't. You're choosing her over us? Mr. Davis's voice wavered between disbelief and fury. Mike squared his shoulders. I'm choosing to live my life on my terms. The silence that followed was suffocating. The weight of unspoken words pressed down on all of us. Mrs. Davis finally straightened, her expression carved from ice. "Very well," she said, her voice void of warmth. "But remember this, you're turning your back on your family, on your faith, all for her." Mike's voice was quiet but firm. "I'm not turning my back on anyone. I just wish you'd see that." Without another word, Mrs. Davis turned on her heel. Mr. Davis followed, his face set in stone, and just like that, they were gone, leaving behind an empty space filled with hurt, uncertainty, and the undeniable truth that things would never be the same. A few days later, as I arrived home from work, my neighbor, Mrs. Carlson, stopped me on the sidewalk. She was an older woman known for her daily walks and for always knowing everyone's business. "Did you hear?" she asked, her voice brimming with curiosity. "The Davis family never sold their house." I blinked. "What do you mean?" She leaned in conspiratorially. "They never put it on the market. Susan heard from Janice, who works at the real estate office. There's no record of the Davis property being for sale." A cold knot tightened in my stomach. Had they been lying to us all along? When I got home, I shared the news with Mike. He stared at me, stunned. "I can't believe they'd do that. What were they trying to accomplish?" But we both already knew the answer. "They wanted to manipulate us into letting them move in," I murmured. "It was all a game." Mike exhaled slowly, rubbing his temples. This changes everything. It's one thing to have disagreements, but to outright lie, to manipulate us like this? I nodded, my voice resolute. "We need firm boundaries. No more letting them pull us into their games." Mike met my gaze and nodded. "You're right, we can't keep doing this. It's unhealthy for us, for our relationship." The next day, he went to confront them. When he returned, his expression was a mix of anger and sadness. "They admitted it," he said, his voice heavy. "They thought that if they moved in, we'd be a real family again. They felt threatened by our independence." We sat together processing the revelation. It was clear we needed distance. "We need a break," Mike said finally. "Time away from all this drama." I reached for his hand. "It's the best decision for us right now." That evening, we sent them a message, informing them of our decision. Their reply was filled with anger and accusations, but we didn't waver. The following weeks were quiet, peaceful. For the first time in a long time, we focused on each other, on rebuilding the love that had been strained under months of tension. One night, as we sat on our porch gazing at the stars, Mike turned to me. "Thank you," he whispered, "for standing by me, for fighting for us." I smiled, squeezing his hand. "Always." The road had been long and filled with trials, but it had also been a lesson in love, respect, and the power of setting boundaries. As the night deepened, we looked forward, not with fear, but with hope.